Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today whizzing around in front of me is a British infantryman from the British Army of the Rhine, who were there as part of a bulwark against perceived Soviet aggression during the Cold War. Now this figure would also work for pretty much any of the conflicts that the British were involved in or during peacekeeping missions of that period, sort of mid to late 20th century, before DPM was eventually phased out. Now this fella here is a 3D print. He comes courtesy of Flank March Miniatures, and you've seen me do their work on the channel before. The Black Death Soviet naval infantry were what they had done. And you're also going to see in a little while, they're also doing a Kickstarter featuring Soviet infantry so that these guys will have somebody to square off against. Anyhow, all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below, so whether you're painting a 3D print or a physical miniature from some other company, it's not going to matter. The method is going to be the same. So let's get started. So real quick up top, there are timestamps at the bottom of the video if you want to skip ahead straight to the painting. But I'm kind of a numbers fan, and I've got some that you might find interesting. YouTube gives you quite a lot in the way of analytics, all anonymized of course, but they want you to be able to hyper-focus your content to whoever they're trying to advertise to. So they give you an awful lot of information. But some of it's actually quite interesting and might be relevant to what I'm going to be doing today. So if you're interested as well, hang around for a second, because I want to share this with you. You might find it kind of cool. So I'm going to put me chappy down for a second. Now, if you're watching this video, there is a roughly 28% chance that you are American. Now, just beyond that, at 24.4% chance, you're probably from the United Kingdom. Now, Canada, Germany, and Australia are the next big hitters, all at about 6% of the audience each. But the overwhelming likelihood is that you are a native English speaker from either the United Kingdom or America, and you're most likely to be a guy. Now, where this gets really interesting is when we get into the age range of my average audience, because at just over 31% likelihood, you're probably at the age 45 or older, which skews, now I use the word old with a wink and a nudge, but it skews older than I think most YouTube channels would kind of expect, which I find really interesting. I find that cool. Now, if we include 35 and up, that becomes a full 58% of my viewership, which is fascinating because what it means, this uniform in front of me, and this is why it's relevant, there is a non-zero chance that you're someone who has actually worn this uniform professionally. And why do I bring that up? Because this makes it friggin' daunting. Ordinarily, I don't paint uniforms that folks have worn. I think the Vietnam era stuff is probably the most recent that might have been likely, but this dude, there's a non-zero chance that you're someone who has been wearing this kit in a professional capacity. So if you have, let me know how close I've got it, all right? Try not to pull my head off, but let's give this a shot. So with all of that in mind, I've started by priming the miniature in Death Guard Green. Now this one's from Citadel, and I know some folks aren't hugely keen on painting their historical miniatures with Citadel colors, but Death Guard Green is a really useful army man green, for lack of a better term. Almost any green-based military uniform of the 20th century is going to work fine with Death Guard Green as the base. Now we're going to lighten this up a little bit and add some texture to the uniform by giving them a quick dry brush first of all with Underhive Ash. Now any old brush will do the job here, something a bit scruggly. And let's start across his back here. Now, because his webbing is going to be painted a different color later anyway, you can start by dry brushing the webbing to get a feel what you're going to leave behind on the rest of the uniform. And then, once you're comfortable with that, just cruise around quickly, picking out the high points and adding a little bit of depth to his uniform. And once you've got a bit of depth in your uniform, it's time to start applying the pattern. Now, to my eye, the pattern tends to have a slightly horizontal sort of aspect to it. Obviously not straight lines across, but that's how I'm going to try and plan out this look. So I'm starting first with the beige, and what I'm using for this is Skeleton Bone from the Army Painter. This I tend to find easiest to apply with quite a stiff synthetic brush. And I'd suggest you want to cover roughly a quarter of the green with this. Try not to worry too much about the shapes, just splodge it on and then make a little random wiggle. They tend to be quite organic, and some of them will run vertically, so break things up now and then. Don't worry too much if it looks a little bit splodgy, because as we add other colors, we can tidy that up as we go. You'll see this covers the green very well. Now when you come to areas like his webbing, start by painting on top of it and then work away so that you aren't creating a false hard line where there wouldn't be one on the uniform. So away we go, little squigglies and splotches. Now next up for the brown, what I'm going to use is leather brown from the Army Painter. Now the real brown on these uniforms was fairly dark, kind of a chocolatey color. But if you use a dark brown, then once we add the black to this uniform, the brown is really going to blend in with that and it's not going to work as well as you might like. So by instead using a slightly lighter brown here and relying on our shade to give it a bit of warmth when we do that, that's going to work much better. So as you see, this also applies very easily. You want to overlap some of the skeleton bone that you've already done. And we're just following the same premise. Little squigglies, little patches, covering about a third of what we've got left. Now the final color we're going to add, this is German Grey from Vallejo. Now you can use anything that you like here. You could even use a true black, but I would recommend like an anthracite, something which is going to still have a bit of depth to it when we shade this. So we want to be a little more sparing with our black than anything else. These markings, if we add a lot of these, they are going to very quickly overpower what we've done. So these I've swapped to a smaller brush, and you'll see I'm just making tiny marks of this. It's not wholly realistic, but I like to think it's evocative of DPM while still being interesting to look at on the table. Now at the same time, with that off black, you can get in and paint his boots and parts of his SLR as well. Now, as for what follows, it's really up to you in what order you do things, but I'm going to start by laying down his skin, and for this I'm going to start with tanned flesh. Now, this will cover fairly well, but you are likely to need a second coat in some areas. Now with that done, before we go ahead and paint in his webbing, we're actually going to paint in his helmet, because we're going to dry brush the helmet later with the webbing color. I'm using here refractive green, and this will work for any painted metal equipment. Now while that's drying, we're going to apply khaki to all of his webbing and his gaiters. Now this will not look all that green up against his uniform, but it's actually pretty accurate to webbing of the era. So a quick blast of this, and once the helmet has dried as well, you can quickly flick across the top of that with some of that khaki. Doesn't have to be perfect at all, just catch the netting. Now I am going to briefly go back to some skeleton bone and touch in some of the scrim that's on his helmet with this. We're really getting down to the last few bits and pieces here. What I've got, this is stone grey, and I'm going to use this to paint in his scarf. And then finally, I'm going to paint in some of the black bits with a true black. Now here, you could also paint in his hair, which is what I'm going to do. But you could swap in for a brown or a light sandy beige or something if that's what you want instead. But I'm going to go with good old reliable black. Now as well, at this stage, if you find you've put on too much in the way of camo, you've obscured some of the green too much, you can just grab some Death Guard green from the pot and paint in over the camo that you've done already. If it's a little patchy and weird, all the better. It will look more realistic. Now once everything has thoroughly dried and you've done any tidy up that you want to, it's time to shade them. Now what I've got here, this is Strong Skin Shade from the Army Painter. Now this used to be unique to the skin painting set, but it has come out individually as part of the Army Painter Fanatic range. And if it's not in stores for you yet, it should be very shortly. They are coming out individually. So what I've done is mixed up equal parts of that skin shade with speed paint medium, because I don't want it to be quite so strong. Now this is going to look actually quite similar to marine juice, if you've ever seen me use that. Just a little bit more brown and not quite as red. But it is perfect for pretty much everything we're doing. So applying this over the entire miniature, you'll see the important part of thinning it out is that it's now going to give us plenty of shading, but it's not going to massively tint the color. So over everything, oh gosh, I've been holding that much too close, over everything, and in about half an hour once this is dried, let's have a look at what we've got. And then once he's dried, you'll have something that looks like this. Brilliant! It's more or less finished. Like, you could just matte varnish him and put him on the table like this. But as always, I want to take it just a little bit further. So what I'm going to start with is his webbing. And I'm not going to actually highlight his uniform at all, because honestly, we've done so much to it, I think you would probably just not see it. Now to highlight his webbing, I've got here a mix of 2 parts khaki to 1 part ivory. And ivory is a really good universal highlight mixer for anything which is going to be soft, like clothing or canvas and stuff like that. If you want to, you can adjust the mix, add a little bit more of the base color so it's not quite as stark. Or once you've done 1 coat of this, you can do very edged corners with more ivory in there, but it's up to you. I find this super useful for clothing and such. Mechanical things, it won't work so well, and skin, it can look a little peculiar, but for our webbing, this is perfect. And then the only other detail I'm really going to highlight will be his skin. And for this, I'm going to use Cadian Flesh Tone to start off with. I'm going to cover over most of his skin, leaving just a little bit of the tan flesh in the recesses. Now you might see that I've left his bottom lip in that shaded tan flesh. I tend to find it looks a little more natural than trying to paint over the top of it with a darker color. Although you can give that a red wash later on if you want to add a little bit more warmth to that lip. What I'm going to do next is some Kislev flesh, and this I'm going to apply on the pointy bits of his nose, his cheekbones, and his knuckles. Now with that done, ordinarily I would varnish him off screen and do any last minute finishing touches like his base. But I'm going to varnish him now because once I'm done with this, there is one last thing I want to do, and it might surprise you. So I'm going to pop on here. This is Varnish Plus from Instar. Now with that dry, first of all, what a difference it makes to the surface of the miniature. A lot of folks ask me, oh, what happens if my shade dries glossy? Matte varnish. Always the answer is matte varnish. Matte varnish! You want to start getting into the habit of using it, trust me. But the other cool thing that this does is it is a slightly textured surface. So I've got here a 2B pencil. What I'm going to do is just lightly buff along the edges of the SLR, the metal bits, to give us a very slight metallic finish without having to paint them. Now, be careful with this. It does not take long to do at all. And once you finish with that, I'm going to go ahead and base them. Recipe for that one will be in the description, same as always. Let's get a look at our finished trooper in just a second. And so there at last, our British infantryman is complete. And I got to admit that uniform came out pretty much as I was hoping. Maybe a little bit more green if you wanted to play that up from table distance. Would look better, but that's really up to you to decide. So if you have worn this uniform before, let me know in the comments if I've gotten it right. I'm dead curious and a little bit nervous to hear that. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, and very importantly in this case, resin, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you so much for your support, folks. I really mean it. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.